Hi, welcome to the China Unscripted podcast. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
I just want to remind everyone, be sure to check us out on iTunes as well as ChinaUnscripted.com. Joining us today, we have a special guest, Matthew Robertson. Matt, why don't you say hello and give us a little introduction?
Hello, I'm a researcher, I guess. I was a translator and am a translator. I work at a non-profit in DC called the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Currently, I'm a research fellow in China Studies.
Oh, I hear there's a lot of victims of communism, so
Yes.
that's good business.
And I'm about to start a PhD at the Australian National University in January.
Oh, congratulations. I hear Australian universities are very popular with Chinese students.
Yes, there's actually heaps at ANU. And either because there are so many or they're just way more studious than the drunken Australians. When you go to the library, it's only Chinese. Wow.
I also appreciate the use of the word heaps. It's going to be a folksy little podcast.
Well, yeah. Well, it's thematically appropriate for Australia.
How so?
Isn't that Australian slang?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you were at ANU, Chris.
I was. That was if you haven't seen the episode, we have it was so. Thinking back on it, it was insane. We were interviewing Alice Josky about Chinese interference in Australian universities, and I spent most of the episode walking around in a toga.
Outside of your suit, yes.
That's
right.
right.
It's a family-friendly podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Alex was, I think he was pleased.
Uh-huh.
So anyways, enough about me and what I do at other people's colleges. So Matt, you've recently done some writing comparing the persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang to the persecution of another group inside of China, Falun Gong.
Which we then shamelessly used for
Don't give our secrets away.
Okay.
Shelley. So let's begin talking about the Uyghurs. Why is the Communist Party targeting the Uyghurs, do you think?
I don't know.
All right, thanks for joining us, and I'm Chris Chappell.
Let's start with...
Well, it's mysterious, right?
It is.
All these campaigns.
Well, yeah, China is kind of a black box, so there is no clear way to know what's happening. So I've heard, on the one hand, persecution is about ensuring the Belt and Road. Ensuring, the party wants to maintain stability there in a Communist Party kind of way to make sure it's a road, the Belt and Road can connect through it. I've also heard it's an analysis that it's actually Xi Jinping's opponents trying to create trouble in Xinjiang to specifically mess up the Belt and Road. So that's one of those things where you hear completely different views on a single thing. And that's what makes being a China watcher so difficult.
If I had to make up something, I would
Please do.
imagine that it's this is the CCP's MO. And that's the simplest way to understand it. Every 10 years or so, because the way they, it's a mobilizational kind of party. It stirs up political campaigns and then uses them to, direct a lot of resources to some specific goal. And the people on that gravy train get promoted, and especially when issues are elevated to the level of a threat against the party and the nation, then, it's the threat is created.
Well, you bring up a good point there by saying it's the Communist Party's MO. I know a lot of people have been kind of reacting to this persecution against the Uyghurs with shock. Oh my gosh, look at what the Communist Party is doing. This is so surprising. And yet, as you mentioned, this is the MO of the Communist Party.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And also, that ties back into the persecution of Falun Gong, which you've described the persecution of Falun Gong as being very similar to the persecution that's happening with the Uyghurs. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. I think these are very interesting campaigns because they are, both of them, they're so radical in their intent. It's literally about, capturing, hundreds of thousands or millions of people and then, forcefully, like, brainwashing them through torture and, like, ramming your information down their throat and then making them agree that their beliefs are false. It's so extreme and radical, and it's the same. I mean, that was the anti-Falun Gong campaign, basically. That was its operating logic, and those were the quotas that were passed down all throughout the system. It's like transform them, 转化. And so the same, it's exactly, well, perhaps there are some differences, but it's very much the same thing in Xinjiang.
What does transform mean?
It means
Robots
that
in disguise?
it means that they must. So that's funny. This is what makes it beyond the regular podcast.
Oh, it's just my own ignorance.
It's the side jokes.
All right, Transformer jokes aside, let's go to this horrible bloody persecution. Perfect segue.
It's when they make the target renounce their faith and agree with the Communist Party's slogans about it, basically. So whether that's actually genuine or it's just something that's done to get out of there alive, the effect is the same. And so that's what it is on the surface. So they, and they also, it can, like with the anti-Falun Gong campaign, there were specific like things that they had to sign. So like they had to make 3 agreements, like to not practice Falun Gong again, to not promote Falun Gong again, and something else. I'm not sure what it was, and it was implemented in different ways. But it's basically to get people to agree that their beliefs are false and that the party is right. And then when they sign the stuff, then, that's, like tick the box, this person has been reformed, and then they're released back into the society to
be
do
happy,
whatever.
productive members of communist society.
To be rustless screws, yes.
Yeah. Well, that actually sounds kind of similar to what's happening with Christians in China now, where they're being forced to take down crucifixes or pictures of Jesus and put up pictures of Xi Jinping, or sign guarantees that they're not going to practice Christianity, or that they're going to put party ideology above their religious beliefs.
Well, I need to. This is something I haven't studied specifically, but
Okay.
I think at the very least that there's one distinction between these campaigns, which is that with Falun Gong and the Uyghurs, clearly the CCP wants to eliminate those populations. But with Christianity, they seem simply satisfied with limiting them. And that's just that calls for an entirely different set of methods, a different theory, different agencies involved. So it is. I would consider them to be different beasts in a sense.
Why do you say it's clear that they want to eliminate Uyghurs in Falun Gong?
Because that's what everything they do to those populations suggests. This was kind of explicit, at least, in the, when promulgating the policy of the anti-Falun Gong campaign, that they set up a leading small group for handling the Falun Gong question at the Politburo Standing Committee level. So this is the very peak of the policy process in China. Like there were only 7, I believe at the time, 7 members of the PBSC. And so this is like a very peak body in Chinese politics, specifically created to eliminate or to deal with this population. So the Uyghur, what they're doing in Xinjiang doesn't have the same like total central imprimatur, but it's, being led in the same manner at the provincial level. And at least in the Uyghur case, I haven't seen the, have they come out? I don't believe they have, and said, they've said that it's about de-extremification and getting rid of terrorists, but they haven't said that actually we don't like Uyghurs existing. We're just going to turn them into Chinese. They haven't said that but everything they're doing suggests that that's the goal. With the Falun Gong case, it was clear that it's not a population that should exist. Like, it's bad, it's dangerous, they
The
kill
language
themselves.
is very much wipe them all out.
Yeah. Well, at least that's what was said in a meeting, according to someone who's now outside of China in Beijing in '99. It was the eliminate them. It's bankrupt them financially, eliminate them physically, destroy them spiritually, or whatever. I forget the exact phrase, but yes, that was clearly the policy, is to destroy them.
What occurs to me, a lot of people listening might not really be too familiar with Falun Gong now. This was a bigger issue a couple years ago, but now you tend not to hear as much about Falun Gong. So first, Matt, why don't you, for somebody who knows nothing about Falun Gong, can you say what it is?
Sure. Although I think it's helpful to go back to how big of a deal it was at the time.
Sure.
And to some degree still is. But even how it was, it was acknowledged as such at the time. Elizabeth Perry wrote this really interesting article in, I believe it's 2002, called Challenging the Mandate of Heaven. And she laid out how it was that the anti-Falun Gong campaign was like the most significant political campaign against a single target in PRC history.
Well, in the history, really?
Yeah, well, because, so if you look at CCP political campaigns, you can understand the whole history of the CCP even before it took power as one big political mobilization campaign that, achieved certain objectives, and a lot of resources were aggregated to pursue it. And then, people chill out for a while, and then another one starts up. And so that's clear from the Yan'an rectification, and then in the early years of the PRC, when the CCP is eliminating different perceived to be problematic populations, the Cultural Revolution, anti-bourgeois spiritual pollution campaign after Tiananmen, a whole other round of arrests, anti-Falun Gong campaign, even the anti-corruption campaign of Xi Jinping follows the same kind of logic. And then the Uyghurs. So, to me, this is just a very intuitive, straightforward way to understand, major ways that the CCP works, because a lot of people's careers, in the party, are determined, by the participation in these campaigns. Certainly with the anti-Falun Gong campaign, careers were made and destroyed, in fact. And by the early 2000s, it was a key priority issue for the leadership under Jiang. And so the people who implemented it more forcefully were brought up through the ranks more quickly, and enormous resources were devoted to it. But what was kind of remarkable about it in comparison to all other CCP campaigns was because it was focused on one population, eliminating one population. Other campaigns have kind of somewhat broader goals, like the Cultural Revolution, for example. And so that makes it pretty unique. And so I forgot what the question was. Oh, it was what's Falun Gong? Okay.
Yeah.
So
and why it's a big deal.
I guess I was saying,
say.
yeah, so I guess I was starting first with why it's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big deal. That's only after the fact. Although before the fact, it was still quite a unique thing and kind of a big deal in China. And it's, what is Falun Gong? It's a Qigong practice. At least
like Tai Chi, kind of.
Kind of, but the best treatments of this, so it grew out of the Qigong movement in China, and there were thought to be several 100 million people practicing that, at least 100 million people. And
Qigong or Falun Gong in particular?
So Qigong was one of the... So Falun Gong was one of the gongs of many kinds of Qigong that emerged in the 80s and 90s. And Qigongs are it's kind of like a meditation, slow movement practice. And it's believed that they can use, harness energy of the body and the universe to do things.
Like Dragon Ball.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
A spiritual technology is a great way I've heard it described. And so, these have a history and a theory in Chinese religion and philosophy. And you can get books. There's this amazing book. It's called Shen Xian Zhuan in Chinese. I forget the exact, but there was a guy, Robert Ford Campany, did this amazing translation. It's like all these immortals in Chinese history, and they like go to some Taoist, they go to some cave, and then they cultivate these powers, and then they get into fights. And it's so
sounds
cool.
Fun.
Yeah, it's so cool. It's like 700 pages, and it's like just one immortal after another. And so this is like a thing.
I feel like we've found the like origin of like Dragon Ball Z.
Basically. Well, Journey to the West.
Well, that's true. That was actually the origin. But
Which
maybe,
was immortals fighting each other.
okay, so maybe Shen Qian Zhuan is like the origin of like superhero comics.
Okay.
There's
accept that.
something to this, because the idea is that these people, by practicing this spiritual technology and using moral discipline, they're able to change themselves and get powers, because they're like assimilating to the universe, and the universe inherently has these magical properties. And so Falun Gong went kind of beyond Qigong in not just because a lot of the Qigongs, they were like, you can practice and you get this and that supernormal power, and there are people doing all kinds of supernatural things, supposedly. And what's
Sort
very...
of like how if we sign up for some exercise program, it guarantees we can lose a pound of belly fat a week.
Yeah, except
That's
it was like...
definitely supernatural.
You can put a needle through
It's not
glass and
possible.
stuff. So this was a huge thing in China.
Okay.
The crazy thing, so people thought this was real. And as far as like a large portion of the Chinese population concerned, this was real. And so Falun Gong came in that kind of environment. And it went beyond that in linking it to a moral practice. The others were like, you get these cool powers, and you can be healthy, and you can heal people.
Like
But-
energy healing.
Yeah, yeah.
Is
But
what
Falun
these
Gong
other
was like,
practices were
that stuff is
promising.
true, but that's not the idea here. Like the idea is to transform yourself morally and attain salvation in some cosmic sense through moral practice.
So it was a spiritual
Yeah.
practice, in
Yeah.
what you're saying. Okay.
Sounds like a dangerous group that should be crushed.
Uh,
So, yeah.
no.
So,
no.
well, on the surface, what it is 5 exercises.
Mhm.
One of them is a meditation. And in the beliefs, it has a truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance.
Yeah, that's definitely dangerous stuff.
Yeah, you can see why this couldn't remain.
No. So as I understand, Falun Gong became very popular. So according to, I believe, the government statistics, Falun Gong at its peak was anywhere from 70 to 100 million people practicing, which was a lot. It was. So do you have any sense why Falun Gong in particular became so much more popular than some of the other Qigong practices that were out there?
Well, I mean, as a researcher, you can only know what Falun Gong people say and what other researchers who have studied it say. And it seems to be because, I mean, at least initially, people felt that their health was benefited,
Mm-hmm.
And then, Falun Gong practitioners say, well, because it's true. So it's like, that's why it was popular, because it's true.
Truth is true?
Well, people practiced it. Yeah, so I mean, there's like, you can read like sociological explanations, like, after the Reform era, faith in communism had been lost, and people were looking for
Okay.
spiritual.
So it was
Still in a
popular.
spiritual
Yeah,
back-
so,
back kind of thing. Okay.
how you explain big, broad social movements,
It's
I mean,
tough.
it's an open question. But
Okay, so let's
in
just
any
accept
case,
it got
people-
popular.
yeah, people, a lot of people practiced it. It was, I mean, interestingly, it was spread by word of mouth. So someone practices it, then they tell their family. And it was, interestingly, well, until 1994, I believe, it had some institutional affiliation. It was under the Qigong Research Society. It's like there is a whole history here that, I mean, we can't go into the whole thing, but it's kind of useful, at least for understanding that Qigong had high-level patrons in the Communist Party. And they thought it was a new kind of science, and it was a special Chinese kind of science, and that it would be able to rival Western science, and that it was new, that what was new was using the human body itself as an instrument for exploring truth and acquiring knowledge and, acting in the world in ways that were beyond Western materialist empirical science. It's like, and this was a thing, like people actually believe this. The guy, very famous rocket scientist, Chen Xuesen, who was behind the CCP's nuclear program, he was actually ironically chased out of the US by McCarthyites, and he wasn't a communist necessarily, I don't think, but I mean there's some controversy on that. In any case, so people like him, so like highly revered figure,
and educated.
Yeah. And so these guys, like there was a whole group of these guys who basically figured out how they could explain Qigong in using like Marxist theoretical terminology.
Really?
So
I
they
had
like
no
passed it
idea.
off, yeah. And so that's how it like they got through like the hardliners,
So
at least for a while.
So there's a Qigong Science Research Society that's affiliated with the Communist Party.
Yeah, it was under, I would have to check what it was actually under, but it was one of these mass organizations, or it was affiliated with one of the mass organizations. So there was, so there's like a whole history there. So Falun Gong was originally under that. And then basically they wouldn't play ball with the official group, which wanted them to charge money and like, kick up the profits. And Falun Gong was kind of, run in a very like lean. There was no organization, basically. It was a bunch of volunteers, and they wanted to like make money off it. And then
So the organization, so Falun Gong, not wanting to make a profit, got in trouble with the communist state organs that wanted to make money.
that's one way you could put it, I suppose. But in
Seems
the
a bit
end,
ironic.
Falun Gong was deinstitutionalized in the sense that there was no. It was a bunch of volunteers in different cities that would act as contact people, and that's pretty much how it works outside of China now.
So did it get kicked out of the Qigong Science Research Society?
I believe the organization was, to that effect, yes. Or no, it withdrew, I believe,
Okay.
in the end. Or
So-
the guy, the founder, Li Hongzhi, withdrew it, and then it had no institutional aegis. It applied to try to get one, because in China, if you just like have like thousands of people going to parks to practice something every morning, then like, the authorities are starting to ask like, okay, so like what's up? Who are you? Who's your boss? Take me to your leader, kind of thing.
It's a large group, not directly under the party's supervision.
Right. And so, and there's like disagreements or different ideas in terms of determining like what was it that made the CCP like lash out so violently and so extremely and in such a systematic way against Falun Gong. And there's like because they were organized, they were a big organization, and then there's like because they were seen as an ideological challenge, etc. So there's different views. I'm the early, like after the campaign started in July '99.
The persecution campaign.
Yes, the anti-Falun Gong campaign. I think it is, it's really instructive to look at what Xinhua was saying at the time and what the People's Daily was saying at the time.
The mouthpiece for the Communist Party, Xinhua.
Yes. And their explanation was not that it's an organized group and it's going to overthrow the state or whatever. It was that it was a theistic practice that didn't conform to the goals of socialism with Chinese characteristics. That they were preaching idealism, and it was an ideological threat. And Jiang Zemin said the same thing, that our political thought work among grassroots cadres has been inadequate. That's the only reason they could go in for something like this, and that Marxism will definitely triumph over the Falun Gong stuff. He wrote that in a letter, or words to that effect, to other members of the Politburo Standing Committee in April '99. After that, there was a massive protest, or an appeal or whatever.
So is it actually Marxism or socialism with Chinese characteristics that they care about? Like, is it the ideology that they care about? Or is it that this was like a challenge to their political power or whatever?
Yeah, I think the latter, but the challenge is seen through an ideological lens. So I think it's a little hard to disentangle the two, because in the one sense, the ideology, whether it's like just a window dressing or something that's somehow deeply held, which there are many indications that it's not, which we can talk about. But at the very least, if there is some other ideology or belief that is extremely popular, then it appeared that the Communist Party felt threatened simply, by dint of the popularity, because it's like, well, those people, they're not with the party. And so if they're with this, so it's like, and they, the Xinhua as well, they said it very explicitly, that Falun Gong was competing for the masses. So, you can't compete for the hearts and minds of the masses with the Chinese Communist Party.
It's like the worst popularity contest
Yeah.
ever.
Yeah, I'm thinking like most clubs try to be exclusive, like, keep out people they don't like. The Communist Party is like, you have to be part of our group, otherwise we'll kill you.
Or, I mean, they only let the special people in, but like you have
Everyone
to.
else has to admire
Yes.
themselves. I see.
But it was very interesting because they won't kill you if you don't want to be part of the group. They'll just make you be part of the group. And so if Falun Gong people, like, if they just said, oh, okay, well, I didn't know you guys didn't like that. Well, no problem. Like, we'll just stop practicing and we'll be good party members. What would you like us to do? What do we sign? Well, then, like, there would be no persecution of Falun Gong, right?
Well, it's
Like,
interesting you
everyone
say
just be
that.
like, all right, I understand now.
Well, that's because this is the thing that like I think people have a hard time understanding if you grew up in America or like you just don't have a lot of familiarity with the ideological struggle part of the Communist Party is that like it seems like why do you care so much about whether people believe in truth, compassion, and tolerance or whether they believe in Islam or like it's what's it to you,
Yeah, well, there's the question of whether the degree to which this is just kind of naked power grubbing, and whether it's considered to be a genuine threat, because I think you could understand it from both perspectives in a way, because like say for the anti-Falun Gong campaign, and same with the campaign in Xinjiang, if you like cook up a threat and then you sell that to the higher ups and you're like a hardliner, I mean you win, and there's no like downside, because then you've created a threat to the Communist Party, basically, and then because you've identified some group and then you've packaged it that way, and then now you get like carte blanche to deal with it, and then that's resources, that's promotions, that's power in the system. And so there's, just from a practical perspective, there are many factors that like amplify that kind of tendency, and there are no mitigating factors against it really. So you can push hard in that direction. Like this is just a common thing with communist systems. So, there is a tendency for this to kind of snowball, and then these are the logical outcomes of the structure, the political structure, and the way incentives operate.
Because that's how ultimately everyone gets their power and prestige by
Or at least that's a surefire way,
and
there is nothing.
It's much easier than trying to like, raise GDP in your province.
just build more skyscrapers. It's easy.
Build skyscrapers or imprison 1 million people.
Both are good. Well, so since we're on this topic, so basically Falun Gong was very popular, and then it was persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party. Or did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, well, so there were 3 years of jousting inside the party about how they're going to deal with it. So it wasn't that everyone wanted to persecute it. There were some that were like, well, we need to guide them gently. And I was like, we don't need to worry about them. And this went on for at least 2-3 years, like from 96 onwards, basically. And so there were a lot of, that was the other thing, there were a lot of people in the Communist Party who practiced Falun Gong, and in the military and so on. So in Jiang Zemin got a letter from, I believe it was a former director of the 301 PLA hospital. So like a very top, he was a retired, very top doctor, like in the party, wrote to Jiang saying, hey, like, please don't, Falun Gong's good, and this long letter. And that like cheesed him off even more, because it's like the CCP thinks like they're being infiltrated. So it's like,
yeah.
because this is like how the CCP got power, right?
Yes.
It's like infiltrates Kuomintang, and this is like a communist subversion, like 101. It's like you replace their people with your people, and then you become that thing.
It's a hard system to trust people in.
Well, that's the whole point. And in a sense, we're kind of getting off topic, but it relates to this whole issue, which is kind of that. I've met a lot of democracy people that they don't like Falun Gong because it's not anti-communist party enough.
You mean Chinese democracy activists?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that seems an odd thing for them to think, because like Falun Gong, collects renunciations of the Communist Party and has very anti-Communist Party, statements and rhetoric.
Although that was post.
Yeah, post, but
Yeah,
yes.
post the anti-Falun Gong campaign. Yeah.
Yes. But even now, if you speak to Falun Gong practitioners, they, for example, they won't say directly negative things about Xi Jinping, because he hasn't been, like, the anti-Falun Gong campaign under Xi has not been a political priority. Has not, like, it's still going on. There's still people being tortured and so on, and it's still very much on the books. But it's not like for the previous, 16 years, 13, 14 years, like from like late 2013, 14. It's like there hasn't been more political emphasis from the top against Falun Gong, from the PBSC level. And so what was I saying? I was saying that the anti-democracy people, they have a problem. Yeah, and so it goes back to the kind of the subversion.
People.
Yeah, the pro-democracy people. Yes, did I say anti?
You did.
Whoops. But it's simply that in a funny way, there's an understandable case for the concern that the Communist Party would be subverted by Falun Gong, in the sense that if eventually, like, all the Communist Party members, or like a large amount of them, were like, let's just say it's not Falun Gong, they're like Taoists, and they actually believe in Taoism really seriously, and then they practice Taoism. Well then, if you like told, like, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of Taoists to go massacre students, and they actually believed in their Taoism and they like refused to do so, then you kind of have difficulty running a totalitarian regime.
It stops becoming the Communist Party and becomes normal human beings.
Yeah, and so I think there's something too, even though it seems very like bizarre, like, hey, it's just like the guy, he's the former, director of your hospital, and now he's got like this meditation practice he does. What's the big deal? But like, you kind of have to understand things from the CCP's point of view, if I may put it that way, in the sense that there is something to this, even though if you're thinking about things normally, well, you kind of couldn't countenance seeing someone's beliefs as a threat. But if you understand the totalizing mindset of the CCP, then you can quite readily understand how sincerely held religious and moral beliefs that determine your outlook and your conduct and how you respond to things, that is a very serious concern for the CCP.
So a Chinese citizen needs to be ready to do anything the party wants at any time, and anything that gets in the way of following party directives is a threat.
I think that is true. I mean, you won't see that written down, perhaps not at least in the public documents that they promulgate, but I certainly think you could understand, to a certain degree, that the party operates in that manner.
So one thing you wrote in your article is the idea that many of the tactics the party used in persecuting Falun Gong, they kind of refined and perfected against Falun Gong, and now those tactics are being used against Uyghurs.
I read that, did I?
Something like that.
Okay.
I made it sound
That's
way
not,
better.
Not a bad point.
Yeah.
Well, I think
It was a good point.
at the very least, it's been a process of refinement.
Mm-hmm.
I think hopefully that was the point that I was trying to make, because before the party took power, Michael Dutton has this really interesting book, Policing Chinese Politics, and he, at least to some degree, traces the refinement of like party purge campaigns And so, like, in the 20s, in these Soviet areas, they were pretty brutal. Like, they just rounded up the Bolsheviks, or like the whoever was against the party leadership at the time, just shot them. It's like executions, brutal. And then by Yan'an, they're like reforming them, brainwashing them. And that was for new, intellectuals who had come to join the party and were suspected of maybe being spies for the Kuomintang or many others. And, well, so the point is simply to say that there's been a constant process of refinement. And so whatever they've learned from the anti-Falun Gong campaign and so whatever they learned from all those other decades of campaigns were applied to, in the anti-Falun Gong campaign. And then I would certainly think that the same, you can see all the very similar things with Uyghurs. Mm-hmm.
So they're upgrading their persecution technology.
Broadly construed, I should think. But we haven't seen, so I think it would be really interesting this sounds kind of cold, but like later when there's material, it would be very fascinating to understand how they, because they have internal documents on, like, for example, just the torture and brainwashing process. And maybe they use euphemisms in those documents to refer to torture. But it's not like an ad hoc thing that they have been doing. Like, this is a very deliberate and systematic process. And for example, in the anti-Falun Gong campaign, I don't know if I mentioned it in that piece I did for China Change, but officials were given awards for, the most successful transformation scores. And they taught, they had training sessions for other labor camps and brainwashing centers.
By transformation scores, that means the number
The
of
quotas,
people
yeah.
that they managed to turn.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And
To
so,
say, I'll no longer practice Falun Gong, I love the party.
yeah, well, effectively.
Mm.
Yeah. And there were also, academics who, there were departments in universities for studying this issue, like anti-cult departments, and then they would produce materials.
Anti-cult, because that's what they labeled
Yes.
Falun Gong as.
Yes.
Sort of how they now label Uighur Muslims as terrorists.
Right. And I'm sure you could see, in fact, it would be fascinating to know whether some of the same people who were doing the anti-cult workbooks that were used in labor camps have now kind of moved on to the next thing, and they're doing the
Religious
extremification.
extremism, yeah.
What
So-
a life's work.
But the point is simply to say that this is it's something taken very seriously. Like, huge amounts of intellectual resources and material resources are poured into this issue of how you, break people down, control their environment. You have the facilities for doing so. They had the theoretical underpinning with these academics. They had the security guys, promulgating the best practices.
That's horrifying.
So horrifying, I guess we have to
But
laugh.
It's very interesting to study. So the reason I know so much about this stuff, my PhD is on the development of organ transplantation in China. And
At first, that doesn't seem related at all.
it is widely, there is a great deal of evidence that would suggest that Falun Gong has been a major target of organ harvesting. And so, as part of that research, then I have, and for some time, read a great deal about the anti-Falun Gong campaign.
And supposedly they're also harvesting the organs of Uyghurs as well, to a lesser degree, but the statistics are probably a bit hard to gather.
It is very difficult to know. It stands to reason. As part of my field work, I want to try to investigate that question to the extent that it can be on the ground among exiles. However, the reason that this is thought to have happened to Falun Gong, or at least one of the pieces of evidence, is witnesses outside of China now who testify to have not only being blood tested, which is to some degree par for the course in labor camps when everyone is admitted, but subject to very odd examinations of their organs, abdominal organs, heart, lungs, including with ultrasounds, x-rays, and in a way that's outside of the standard labor camp health inspection process, so that it will be a bus that comes from outside, and then only the Falun Gong people are marched in, and no one says anything, and they take several vials of blood, and they're given these extensive examinations, and those, not for general health, and those examinations would be necessary. So if you were to use their organs or identify them as potential forced donors, you would have to do that, and they're difficult to explain in another way, and so that with many other things is part of the reason that it is thought that they may have been used as an organ source. Yes, so that same evidence does not yet exist for Uyghurs, as in like a lot of people outside China, but that could change with people just slipping through the cracks and then coming out and testifying to that. And if we see that, then, these things are very difficult to prove. So that's part of the, why I'm doing the PhD, is to kind of understand from a social science perspective what counts as proof, so to speak.
That's certainly some of the most ghoulish things I've heard in a while. And I just watched Netflix's new Sabrina show, which is all about Satanism. Okay, so
I admire your attempt to lighten up the topic by talking about Satanism.
Sabrina with the cat?
yeah,
Yes.
they made a new one.
There's a new one that's darker.
Yeah, there's all kinds of Hail Satan.
Everything's getting darker.
I'm just
That's
disappointed that the cat doesn't talk in the new one.
The cat in the new one is like this weird, scary demon monster
No,
thing.
that was the best part, the snarky cat.
No,
puppet,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
not snarky. Sabrina's kind of snarky. Hey, anyways, we're doing a podcast. So
We needed to lighten it up with
we
Satanism.
did. All right, organ harvesting. Let's lighten it up. Satanism. So definitely what I'm gathering from you is like this has been happening. The idea of the Communist Party singling out a group and persecuting them. They've been doing this for a long, long time. But I've noticed there seems to be almost a sense of surprise about the persecution of the Uyghurs. This idea that, China's getting worse, which it seems to me like, just look at Falun Gong. It's not getting worse. It's always been this bad. But it seems like there's sort of a disconnect where like people have kind of forgotten what happened to Falun Gong.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, so why do you think that is? What's going on there?
Although I think the timing. I mean, I think there are at least two ideas or ways of addressing it. One is simply, the place, and I mentioned this in the piece very briefly, but the place that Falun Gong occupies in Western consciousness versus Uyghurs, to the extent that it occupies any place, but is different, and that I think has determined the reactions. But just stepping back from that, the timing is, I think, also quite important. So like 1999, there weren't as many, China was not as connected to the world as it was. Communications technologies were not as advanced. So like, let's say, if Falun Gong was taught in China like in the year 2000, and then now, and like, by now you've got like 70 million people or whatever, and then now it's persecuted, I imagine that the reaction would be kind of similar. And at the time, also, the anti-Falun Gong campaign was like very widely covered in the media. The issue is that like after like a few years, just dropped off because like, hey, it's nothing to see. Like, it's, this is, we're right, it's still going on.
Same old.
Right.
Same old
So we
torturing
can-
people. Yeah.
We can look forward to the Uyghur story dropping off when newspapers and
It's
TV shows stop getting the views from it.
well, like if you imagine the ideal scenario for the CCP, obviously they're trying to like get rid of this population, like by even like breeding them out
Right.
and like transforming them. And so like in 10 years, like, so they don't want the Uyghur to exist. And you could imagine a scenario in which like they have succeeded. Well, it appears that, can you see, like, unless there's some big political change in China and the campaign stops, if everything continues on current trajectories, I don't see why they will not be successful. And then in 20 years...
Despite the public outcry that's currently going on.
Yeah, well, like, I mean, the public outcry obviously doesn't determine what
Right.
Xinjiang is doing
No,
up there.
they can. They feel like maybe they can just like have some like CCTV come in and do a video about how it's just we're teaching them how to work in factories,
Right.
and
Making
also
sure they don't become terrorists.
and they also they get to make their bread, so we're not eliminating their culture. Yeah.
They still
Yep.
get to make the bread?
Yeah, there was
That's nice.
one that CCTV had, like, it was like a 60-minute style thing where they're, like, going inside one of these, re-education camps and all the happy workers learning to, sew pants and stuff like that. And also they're making electric ovens to make their naan bread. So it's like they're upgrading
Nice one.
New Uyghur culture, right? Yeah.
That's
Same
just
thing
reminded
with
me-
Tibet. Oh, go ahead.
When there were reporters that were brought to tour, I believe it was Masanjal, like one of the most brutal labor camps. It might have been another one. Doesn't
Mhm.
particularly matter which one it was, but that was torturing Falun Gong. And they, the guards had like set up everything really nice. They had like bunnies and deers.
Wait, like,
And deer, like
Deers.
Yeah.
wait, like animals?
yeah, like cuddly, fluffy animals, like in the courtyard, like hopping around, nibbling on the grass and
It's
stuff.
not a labor camp, it's a petting zoo.
I had no.
Wow.
There's an old report about that, so it's like it's kind of
Torture on Monday, finger painting on Tuesday.
It's pet therapy. It's
Well,
it's
yeah, because
animal
they were-
therapy.
well, because they're being deprogrammed from the sinister cult, right? And so
Mhm.
the animals would have helped. You can imagine how people they would have workshopped that.
Did
we
that
need-
work with the reporters?
I think they noted it in a kind of ironic way.
Mhm.
I mean, clearly they wouldn't be that stupid. Like, oh, this is
Yeah, I mean, after the history of the Soviet Union, I think we know that, like, anytime, like, foreign reporters get a tour of a labor camp, or a detention center, it's probably not exactly what you're seeing.
right. I just think it's a wonderful touch.
It is. Oh my gosh, where do we go from petting zoo, labor camp? Shelley, I need you to feel this one.
well-
I'm just lost.
Well, I
in
thought it was
tears.
interesting what you were talking about. Like, the part of the reason is kind of the way that the internet works now, right? That people know about this stuff more widely.
Even in China.
Yeah. Well, I don't actually know.
Well, they
how
have internet in China
Yes.
more now.
But like people are doing things like using Google Earth to find these labor camp or re-education camps
Oh,
and
yeah.
things like that wouldn't have been done. But
Right.
Which
but-
actually makes me kind of scared about what Google satellites are doing outside of China. Anyways, carry on.
okay,
But
that's
they're not
not-
Google's.
Are they spying on me, Shelley? I mean, I wouldn't blame them.
mhm.
I live an exciting life.
No. Okay.
You had a point. I'm sorry. You're taking a long time to get to it.
So my question is kind of, you said, let's say the regime doesn't change in the next 10 years. You think that, like, there's no reason the campaign wouldn't be successful. Has there ever been a campaign that the Communist Party stopped for, like, other reasons than its successful conclusion?
I don't know. I mean, usually, in past campaigns, they achieve their targets and then they no longer become relevant and there's some new political objective. And so things just move on. And so, like, yeah, the classes that they targeted in the 50s,
There are no longer any counter-revolutionaries.
no more rightists.
Yeah.
Well, there are actually, but
Well, like for Falun Gong, you said like that Xi Jinping's doesn't seem to be emphasizing it, but it's still like the mechanism of the system is still going on.
So with Falun Gong, it has not succeeded. Or it has.
well, no. Obviously, I mean, the goal was to, eliminate it within 3 months. I believe that was the idea. I haven't seen that in official documents. but-
Over-promising, under-delivering.
And so, yeah, in a sense, that's been a spectacular failure. But it's not like they can just say, "Oh, hey, about that campaign, well, we kind of messed up on that, and we're just gonna rescind it." So, no harm, no foul. You guys can go back to practicing.
Go home. We're cool.
And so, yeah, apart from the practical obstacles, but there's also the No, the Communist Party can't be wrong, obviously. I mean, you guys have been
Obviously.
doing this podcast for long enough to know that. And so, from that perspective also, you can't just, like, take your bat and ball and go home. And, yeah, so the campaign has failed, but, I mean, it's still in the books.
When riding a tiger, it is difficult to get off. It's a
Yes.
Chinese saying.
But the
Yes,
Falun
shall I
Gong
give
campaign
you
is more
praise?
difficult to win
Mm-hmm.
than, like, if you have a distinct ethnic population in one area,
Mm.
and you can, like, then you can actually, like, I mean, they will, I mean, I don't want this to sound the wrong way, but unless something changes, it appears that they will achieve the goals, which appear to be to eliminate that group as
And
a group identity.
Yeah, cultural identity. So
Yes.
Not just cultural identity, they are breeding them out of
well,
existence.
and they can't breed all of them out at once. So, but the idea is like younger Uyghurs will stop identifying as Uyghurs
Yeah.
and identify as Chinese.
Yeah,
right?
identicide is a good term.
Did you come up with that?
No, Steve Levine, a historian.
Identicide.
Yeah, such a good, because I visited him in North Carolina. He's a retired history professor, and we were just talking about these campaigns and like what is it that the CCP is doing when it targets a population and then like eliminates them, but that population is cannot necessarily be defined by purely like racial, or in the case of Falun Gong, it's like not a race, it's a practice, but. Well, anyway, identicide perfectly summarizes what
It's the destruction
CCP
of
is
their
doing.
identity.
Yeah,
In a way, they're doing that in Hong Kong, even.
yeah, big time. And so I think this is you guys should popularize it.
Oh wow, we
You
will
heard
now.
it here first on China Unscripted. Identicide. Use it at parties. Impress your friends.
But people would be impressed, I think.
Yeah.
We were impressed when you said it. Both of us were like, "Wow, yeah,
What
wow."
a nice new word.
Yeah.
I like the feel of it in my mouth.
Identicide. Yeah.
We should get him on the podcast. What was his name?
Steve Levine.
Steve Levine.
He's a really interesting guy.
So is there any? I guess is there any hope for the groups being identicided?
Well, I mean, you don't want to say no, right?
I'm hoping you're not going to say no.
But that almost makes it sound like it maybe is no.
Yeah. Yeah, I should go back to watching Sabrina. It's much more uplifting than this.
I just research things, or I just try to research
Okay.
things.
You just help us understand why the world is a terrible place, not how we can fix it.
Well, look, what if, I'm just trying to think of a scenario in which the Uyghurs could, like, not be eliminated. So what if everyone kept being a Uyghur? And they continued their, teaching, well, it's very difficult under the current circumstances. So hopefully, like, the political impetus will kind of peter out a bit in a few years, and there will be, like, they won't have shipped out, like, a sufficiently huge number of the population to the rest of China, because that's like the latest thing. And when I first saw the reports about that, I was like, nah, because they built so many camps, like, why are they just shipping people out? But it seems, at least in part, those are one-way trains.
So Uyghurs are being sent to other
Yeah,
parts
like
of
distributed around the prison system in the rest of China. And this is like why kind of my ears pricked up in terms of the organ transplantation angle, because
Putting minorities or special groups onto trains, long train rides, that doesn't have a good history.
right, and so if you so I'm just like wildly speculating. Okay, this is not in any way any kind of legitimate scientific hypothesis testing,
But it's educated speculation.
if you wanted to use Uyghurs as an organ source for hospitals around China, you have to get them there, right? So,
Because the best organ transplant centers are not way out in Xinjiang.
well, I mean, you can't
Why take the organ
yeah,
somewhere?
you
where
can't. Like,
you
that's
can't?
just completely impractical, right? You
You-
can't.
You very a kidney, it's like 6 hours, a 6 hour window.
I think it's 12. cold ischemic time, like the time after it's removed from the body. Something it's 12 to 24. It's longer than livers.
Okay.
But in any case, like that's completely impractical. Like to each hospital, right? So so the way it worked, the hospitals had a direct relationship with prisons and potentially labor camps, and that's where they got organs, like for the longest time.
Also, it's a good way to disappear people in terms of if you can see the labor camps in Xinjiang and you can like if they're spread out around the country, it's harder to keep track of how many Uyghurs are being incarcerated, right?
Yeah, I should think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, that's one thing that I thought of when it was like Xinjiang has become really visible in the last couple of years, partially because like it's a concentrated place. You can see the security apparatus. Like reporters can literally go to Xinjiang still and like see everything that's happening there. I mean, you probably will get kicked out of China after, but it's visible in a way that it's harder for the Falun Gong thing to be visible because it's spread out and largely underground.
Oh, yeah, any underground group in China. You can't pinpoint it the same way that you can Xinjiang Uyghurs.
So you're saying the Uyghurs could possibly survive if they kind of went underground?
Well, but they are identifiable by physical features. So that...
Whoa. What do you mean by physical features?
They're not Han Chinese. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. So what is this going to take? Is there going to need to be external pressure, or is it going to need to require a change within China, within the Communist Party?
To stop the campaign?
To stop all the sadness. I don't know why you're laughing.
I think it's a laugh cry is what's happening here.
There's a lot of that with the show.
Oh, God. Okay.
Laugh cry.
I don't know. It's like
Laugh
that's
cry,
the
you heard
high
this,
school
you-
newspaper question.
High school newspapers are great in many ways. I mean, I'm not saying I ever wrote for one, and it was the best days of my life, but it's a good question. How can we make the world a better place? No, seriously.
World peace.
Is there anything the international community can do to apply pressure on the Chinese Communist Party, or is that futile and the only way anything will change in China is if it comes from within? That's a college paper question. Thank you.
It's an answer. I mean, that's something that hasn't been. We don't know, because there hasn't been that. But if you imagine what it would take to potentially create enough pressure, it would be drastically different international arrangements than we have at present. And so the question as to whether that should be attempted and what effect it would have, I mean, it's not even. I mean, it's just what do you reckon? Is this, you know what I mean? There's so many interests and I mean, it relates to the entire configuration of global trade to a certain degree, because if you were to let's say you just do to North Korea, do that to China. It's okay, we don't know how to stop them completely eliminating this population, and we think that is the number one priority, and we're gonna pull out all the stops to try to stop it, whatever it takes. Well, then everything's on the table, right? If you I don't know, we're just spitballing here, but then that's so that's very extreme, where it could get to.
And I can see what you
and
mean
that's not
by
gonna happen, right?
The idea of
duh.
treating China like North Korea, and blocking it off. That's just even saying that sounds insane.
It's crazy. Yeah, and so so then short of that, you have all kinds of other measures, right? You can use Magnitsky Act to target certain individuals. I think Chen Cheng-kuo has been. I mean, I'm sure someone has prepared a complaint against him, and will that, you don't know what impact that will have. It doesn't seem I mean, I'm sure the CCP could find a face-saving way, technically, to stop the campaign. But the question is, how much pressure would have to be applied, and what kind of pressure, in order to put that at the top of Xi Jinping's list, and then cause all the, because the CCP is kind of this fascinating, wild, interesting beast, because
Like a deer in a labor camp.
It can do certain extremely difficult, complex tasks at a national scale to a high degree of success, like the anti-Falun Gong campaign, for example, or like the campaign against Uyghurs. But like for other stuff, like I don't know, environmental protection or like safe vaccines, these kind of things, like the same effort isn't put into them, obviously. And because like the CCP operates in this kind of campaign mentality or campaign mode, it's able to achieve those policy objectives. It's just that they're like the wrong things. And anyway, like why would you run a country on that basis? But I just mean that obviously they could stop it because they just like stopped like locking people up. But then I don't think people are kind of thinking through what you would actually have to do. I mean, I think you could, technically, right? Like, put enough pressure because technically, like, let's say the US said, like, we're going to try to topple the CCP unless you stop this. And then they actually started doing stuff to do that. I wonder, like, how you would even go about constructing a policy like that. But I suspect you could. I think it would be technically possible, but I think the cost would be so high and it would be such a radical proposition that it's not going to happen. But it's an interesting thought experiment, right?
Mm-hmm. Brought about by my great question.
Yeah, I guess, like, how do you stop them? Regime change.
But you could take us, like, you wouldn't have to, because I think that, like, I mean, I don't know how these conversations would go with Xi Jinping. But if, like, let's say that he thought that, we have to stop this because it's going to be crazy otherwise, then they would be able to figure out a way to stop it. Like, they could come up with something. Think of something they could come up with. What would they say?
What she?
Yeah, like you got to come up with an excuse to stop the campaign.
Oh,
against
I would imagine like what Xi Jinping could do is like blame everything on like a rival faction.
Boom. There you go.
Just purge the guy in Xinjiang.
Well, I mean, Xinjiang was tied to the Jiang Zemin faction, and Jiang Zemin was Xi Jinping's main political opponent. So that's not so far-fetched. Why are you looking at me like that, both of you? Is it the wisdom?
Too much wisdom.
Too much wisdom. That could be a good place to end it. So, thank you for joining us today, Matt.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, great. And if somebody wanted to learn more about you or your work, where can they go? What can they do?
I don't know. I mean, I'm on the Twitters.
Twitters. What's your Twitter handle?
MP Robertson. But I don't really post much. My pinned tweet is like, why you just stop talking when you get older.
So you're like a scholar in the Pusong Ling kind of tradition.
I don't know.
Watch out for foxes. Well, thank you.
That is so obscure.
That was just for you.
Seriously.
That was just for you.
If you understood that reference, please leave a comment and let us know.
All right. Well, that wraps up this episode of China Unscripted. Remember, check us out on iTunes or ChinaUnscripted.com. Once again, I'm Chris.
I'm Shelley.
And talk to you next time.